Welcome to the Learning Reinvented Podcast, brought to you by myself, James Poletyllo, and the team at The Learning Effect. There are lots of learning podcasts out there, so we want to do something slightly different. This week, as part of our series of speaking to new voices in learning and development, I'm delighted to welcome Kerrie Chatfield to the podcast. Welcome, Kerrie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So obviously my name is Kerrie Chatfield. My current position is as a L&D manager. We call it the Academy, so Academy Manager at a tech company. But I started off really with a passion for people. So I did sociology at Leicester University, and I was fascinated by why people do things, why groups of people do things, and how society reacts. So I did my studies there, and then after some traveling, I essentially just needed a job. And when I came back from Australia, and I fell into my first role at a business school, Ashridge Business School, which is very luckily quite close to where I grew up. And I was there for 2.5 years as a open program coordinator, essentially helping the tutors put together and coordinate programs for managers all over the world who would come and stay with us and do a course on leadership or finance or influencing skills, managing skills, whatever it was. And I learned so much. So I learned all about the background of how the tutors came up with all their content. I built relationships with coaches that we had in that would help the participants. We had like actors who would come in and role play. And it was just a huge variety of different ways to learn and different ways to give people these skills to take back to their companies and share with their teams. And I loved that whole concept. So I think I really fell in love with the variety of learning there. And then they actually had a strategic alliance with a company in America. And I decided from that, I really wanted to go into HR because it was a huge change management, I suppose, exercise, and there was lots of change. And I realized the impact change can have on people, especially people who have been at a company for a really long time. It didn't affect myself so much. I'd only been there a couple of years, but some people had been there 20, 30 years. So I decided I wanted to do my CIPD. And I decided while I did this, I really wanted to work in a different environment. And I wanted to work in a new environment. So I had 2 different roles to almost use for my assignments in my CIPD, rather than relying on one all the time. So I started working for the fire service in their L&D team, which was completely different and so interesting. So there I looked after things like their coaching pool and created like a coaching network between the fire service, the council and the NHS there. We had like coaches in our own organisations that would coach each other's employees. It was a really cool idea. It worked really well. I also looked after the assessment centre. Like I helped with the assessment centre where you would progress from one role to the next. But essentially my main part of my role there was to ensure that all the firefighters had the skills they needed and the qualifications they needed to be able to go on the run. And on the run essentially means on the fire truck out rescuing people. So it was a really important role, very different to what I was doing before, but really important in the sense that actually if you miss something, then someone doesn't go on the run, and if you don't have enough people, then an area doesn't have a fire truck that day. And if there's a fire there, then, you know, people might die. So there was a real like consequence to actions. And I really liked the difference in, you know, if I missed something in my previous role, maybe one coach wouldn't turn up that day. But actually this was a whole different kind of sense of urgency and detail and impact and consequence. So I learned a lot there. But then I decided I wanted to move to London. So I left the fire service after about a year or so, and I moved to London and I started the role I'm in now. And again, I've learned a lot at this role, and I've been really, really lucky with the companies I've worked for, that I've really grasped every opportunity that's come my way. And that's something I'd really recommend. even if it's something you're not sure if you'll enjoy or you'll get much from, actually you look back in like hindsight and realize how much you can get from every situation. So yeah, I joined and Digital, which is a tech company all around digital transformations, and I've been there for almost 3 years now. 3 years next month.
I think that's a really interesting journey that you've shared with us, Kerrie, because it sort of resonates with me, you know, some of the messages you've talked about there. So sort of falling into your first role, and you know, you've had some initial interest from your studies, which you can then channel in that role, and then progressing through and working for some very different organisations, you know, from someone like Ashridge, you know, talking about real impactful L&D in the fire service, where you're doing something critically important. And you know, at one point I worked very early on in my career for a local authority, and I think sometimes people look down on public sector and think actually there isn't something you're doing that's really critical. But in the same way, you know, if you're working with frontline services in any of those areas, it can be really interesting. And now, you know, into a completely different type of organisation now, where you're working on digital transformation. I think that's quite interesting that you've not necessarily pigeonholed yourself in one sector, one style of organisation. Has that been on purpose, or has that just happened naturally?
I think it's happened naturally. I've always only applied for companies that I really believe in and I understand and believe and endorse what they do. I think that's really important to me. I'm passionate about people and helping people and learning, and I like to combine all of those things. So I think it's naturally happened, but now I think I do it consciously. So I think in my next role, I almost want it to be for a completely different industry. I think, unless a company that is amazing and I really, really want to work for them and they're already in one of the industries I'm in, I would never say no. But I quite like that I have experience in different industries, because I think it almost gives me my unique selling point in that I'm adaptable and I'm flexible, and I can bring about positive learning experience in lots of different scenarios. So I quite like that. It's something I quite enjoy. It keeps me on my toes, and it means I learn a lot, and I'm passionate about learning, like, yes, for other people, but also for myself.
Yeah, absolutely, because you're able to take your experience from one sector, take that into a new environment, test your thinking, test your application, learn new things from that sector as well. So, you know, it really enables you to move on and build your skill set. So across all of that stuff you've done in your career so far, what's been the biggest challenge?
That's an interesting question. I would say it's with my most recent company, so the company I'm at now. When I joined in, trying to think of the year I joined now, 2018, I was probably there around 4 or 5 months, and we decided to run a company-wide learning event, and I was to be the project manager of it. So I was to be the person who was overseeing essentially the whole planning of the big event. And I was still quite new, so I think I'd got a good grasp of the company. I think you can do that within sort of 3 months or so, but I was still quite new in the sense that I was, you know, keen to impress and find my feet. And it was a huge challenge because it's a huge event. So it was for everyone in the company. It was around 300 people at the time, and I really, really wanted it to be successful. So that was probably my biggest challenge. And I'd never actually ran an event before, so I'm not an event planner. I have never worked in the events industry, but I was happy to take on the challenge, and I'm so glad I did, because it's probably been the biggest learning experience for me in terms of how many things go on behind the scenes and how much goes into planning these events, and the team of people, because it wasn't just a solo effort. Yes, I was the project manager, but I also had, we called it the steering group. But essentially a group of people who were involved in the planning. So someone would look after marketing, someone would look after like the content, etc. And then my role was to essentially be on track and keep all of them on track and understand what was going on and how it all fits in together. So I learned tons from actually how to start this, how to manage a budget, how to set success criteria, how to make the content engaging, the structure of a day, like things like timings I hadn't really thought of before, actually are so important to make sure that you get the most from the day and people get the most from the day. So there was so much involved that I hadn't had experience in before. So it was definitely a challenge thinking, oh, I forgot to mention, this is probably a pivotal part, the event was to be in 2.5 months' time. So it wasn't actually that long to plan. So I think I was told around August time, and the event was in middle of October. So it was a quick deadline. It was fast approaching. And I do think the longer you have to plan something, the more like, not laid back, I guess, because there's always a lot to do. But I think the more sort of like you can create a proper like project plan. And I think I almost had to do that, but just really quickly. And like, it was quite intense every week to make sure we got a venue secured, because lots of venues actually get booked up like a year or two in advance for big events. So actually, when I probably rang and spoke to about 30 or 40 different event venues, and there was probably only about 3 options. So actually, like, that was quite stressful. And I remember for a couple of weeks when I first started, my challenge was, are we going to have an event? Like, are we going to have anywhere to actually go on this date? And we'd already set the date, and the date wasn't flexible. And yeah, it was very stressful. But I think what's really nice is actually it did go really well, and I did overcome that challenge. And we turned it into an annual event, and the event ran in 2019. And maybe this was even the bigger challenge in a sense, because although we had slightly longer to plan, we wanted it to be bigger and better than the year before. And I think being the project manager again and having that sort of expectation of it's now going to be for the whole company, which was probably doubled at the time, probably around 500-600 people, plus some of our key clients, which was around 100. We were about 100 clients, about 700 people, and having the pressure of it needs to be better than last year. It needs to be, such a good standard because clients are coming. And actually, let's not have it in London this time, which is where I am based. Let's have it in Leeds, and not actually physically being there where the venue is. Didn't make a huge difference in the end because you can visit, you have video calls. But I remember thinking that was a big deal at the time and being like, how am I going to plan an event when I'm not there? So that was definitely a challenge. And I actually had some really personal circumstances going on at the time. My dad passed away in the middle of planning it, and having to organise that event and make sure it still happened whilst dealing with that was really, really challenging. And probably the hardest thing work-wise that I'll probably ever have to do, because you have to put yourself first, but also put work first too. And like, yes, people helped out at the time, but I had to come back at some point and continue my project manager role. So I had a couple weeks off and then came back and had to like dive into it. In a sense, it was a good thing, but it was a challenge, and I can't think of a bigger challenge in my life than having to endure that. Your biggest challenges can, they vary person to person and situation to situation. But for me, I think the first year was a challenge in the sense that it was new, I was new, and I'd never organised an event before. So that was a challenge. But I think the second year was a challenge in its own way, because it needed to be bigger and better. Clients were coming, it was in a different location, but I was also going through a lot myself and having to juggle, juggle what I was going through, losing my dad, and having to juggle my project manager role of this huge event, which my company were very good about, and I probably could have given it to someone else. But I think when you've done it the year before and you thought you were doing it again, I think it almost kept me going in a way, in the sense that like it gave me structure. But I think just because it gave me structure doesn't mean it wasn't still a challenge. And I think making sure everything was done and everyone was meeting their deadlines, and this event is like the best work day for all your employees for the entire year, where they get this entire day off and they get to attend this learning event where they choose all the different areas, different talks they want to go to. So we had like streams into like tech, product, people, delivery, and our people were delivering all these talks, and we had a keynote speaker, and like wanting it to be the most amazing learning experience for other people is a huge pressure, and that naturally comes with challenges. But it's also really nice when you overcome them, and you can see people enjoying themselves on the day. And even if things do go wrong, I think appreciating that it doesn't really matter. Things don't go perfectly. The first year, the lanyards didn't turn up, and we had no lanyards at like 4 p.m. the day before the event. And at that time, it felt like the end of the world. But then you look back in hindsight and you're like, yeah, I found some plain ones that weren't branded last minute from this warehouse somewhere in London, and no one noticed, and it didn't matter. Like, we knew that they hadn't turned up, and we knew it was really stressful and a challenge, but ultimately no one else did, and no one else cared. And I think it makes you realise not everything has to be perfect or go the way you thought it would go, but it can still be an amazing end result. So definitely the most challenging part of my career so far, but probably the most rewarding too.
I think, thank you for sharing that with us. I think there's some, really important things in there. You've obviously shared a really difficult personal circumstance that you've been through at a key time in work. And I think it's interesting. Some people will share those with colleagues. Some people will keep them, hidden inside. But, we're all human. We're all coming to work, and we've all got different challenges going on. And maybe even in the last year, one of the positives that have come out of that is it's almost a bit more okay to be human and to share some of your background, your stories, your challenges, and I think dealing with loss of any sort, and I'm really sorry you've been through that, but it's really hard for that individual, and how they balance and how you see people change. And you talking about having that focus, and sometimes some people are helped by that distraction, some people aren't, but it's great that you could sort of channel something into your work. On the sort of lighter side, just thinking about as well, your story is almost like a band having that second album where you've had a really successful project, and then suddenly how do you go bigger and better? Because sometimes the first time around, people don't know what they're expecting, so it's all a little bit wow, and it's a little bit exciting.
So true.
And the second time coming back, people are like, oh, this is just like last year. So you've got to go bigger and better, or you've got to go slightly different. But where do you keep the familiarity of what people like last year? So there can be some real challenges in reinventing anything to keep interest over time. And I think you'll probably have learned lessons you realise, and probably lessons you won't realise as well, because they'll just become part of how you do things. And even going back to your lanyard story of things like events or projects or launches that we do in L&D or other roles, get you to deal with that sort of crisis management. And missing lanyards is not really a crisis, but at the time it can feel like one. But it can feel like a crisis, and you're dealing with all of those different things happening, and that problem solving, the team pulling together, finding a creative solution. And like you said, people don't need to know what was in your plan, they just need to know the great experience or impact or outcome that you've delivered. So I think some really valuable lessons just shared it just in that story alone. So thank you very much.
No worries.
And moving on from there, you've come out of the back of that second album. You've obviously coming to terms with things that have happened in your personal life. What happened for you then?
I suppose afterwards I think it's quite an overwhelming feeling after something big like that ends. I think it was something I was working on pretty much primarily as my main project for months. And I think when it's over, yes, there's things to do afterwards, like the feedback, the feedback form and the success criteria, and like sharing some comms on how the day went, saying thank you to people. There's definitely things to do afterwards, but it's on a much smaller scale to what you were previously doing. And I think for me personally, I think I found myself a bit lost, and I was like, oh, I've done this huge event and it's gone so well. What now? And I felt incredibly proud of myself for what I'd achieved, but I also, I wasn't quite sure what to do next. So I decided to do two things. I did one thing and the next thing kind of came naturally. So the first thing I decided to do was write a blog about the experience and actually my experience as a project manager. And I wanted to do this to like share knowledge and share insight from like behind the scenes, but I think it was also a really reflective exercise for me to do, to actually like almost release all those sort of emotions that you've had over the last few months. And I think I definitely recommend, I really like writing things down is a really nice way that I can like understand how I'm feeling. And when I'm planning something, I like to write things down. I really connect with that. And if people feel similar, then I definitely recommend thinking about writing a blog or an article or even like a diary entry after something huge like this, to really sort of release anything you're feeling, share knowledge as well. Like I really enjoyed the fact that I was sharing this knowledge with people. It's also a really nice exercise to look back on. So in 5 years' time, when this event seems like a distant memory, I can actually read this blog and be like, oh yeah, I did that. And it's a really nice thing, like pick me up and a boost of confidence, I think, and it reminds you how you felt afterwards. And then the second thing I suppose I did, this was chance, this wasn't something I planned, but I was looking at the Learning Technologies website, because we usually, as a company, the team will go along to the free bit where all like the suppliers and companies are like basically selling everything. We usually go along to that bit and pick up some brochures, and we find it really interesting and usually connect with a few companies there. But I was on the website and I saw this application form for the Learning Technologies 30 under 30 for learning. They called it the Learning 30 under 30, I think. And I remember just reading it and thinking, oh, that sounds really cool. That sounds really cool. And then something just clicked in my head. And I was like, why don't I apply for this? Because I'm under 30 still at the time. And why not? Like, I've got something really cool that I can share. Because some of the questions were things like, what's been your biggest challenge? Why did you get into L&D? And I was like, I have a really good challenge that I can share. And I'm really proud of what I've achieved. So I decided to apply, and didn't really think much of it after that, to be honest. Kind of forgot all about it. And then I can't remember how long after, maybe a month or 6 weeks after, I got an email to say that I had been chosen to be part of this cohort of 30 people under the age of 30 who were being recognised as like, future leaders in learning and development. And it was such an amazing feeling to be included in that cohort. And I think for me, that was the perfect end to the story, I guess. Not that like my career is over, but it felt like a really nice like initiative, a really nice, I can't think what I'm trying to say, but a really nice
it's a nice marker in your journey, isn't it? It's recognition of what you've achieved, where you've come. Yes. What about beyond the recognition part? What did you get out of being part of that cohort?
Lots, actually. I think for me, it was around, number one, I think what I realised was it's actually really worth going to these conferences. So I think, they do cost, but the notes that I took on that day, I still reflect back on nowadays when things are relevant. And I realised how much I personally learned from attending these different sessions. So that's something was new to me. I'd not been to like an L&D conference before, and I really got a lot from it. And then I suppose I actually was exposed to so many different areas of L&D, the more I realized there even were. So I think I've had experience in like different parts of L&D, but it made me realize that there was so much more out there and so much more that I could get involved in, so much more that I could do. And I think it was exciting to see that actually there's so much more I can still achieve in my career. And there were certain elements I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. Like the design and like the sort of design of L&D, I've not really got involved in like creating content before. And it, you know, hearing people and sharing what they'd done was really exciting. And I, because of that, as a result, I've started creating a bit of content in my company now. And I think I don't know if I would necessarily have realized how much I wanted to do it and how I was like, oh, I really need to do that. I've never done that. And if I haven't been in there and seen that session that I went to. But I think also it made me realize the importance of networking more. So obviously I met the rest of my cohort who were amazing, like inspirational people who had achieved equally amazing things in their career. And that was so interesting to hear. And also we had the chance to meet quite a few different like inspiring leaders in L&D and authors and people who are running sessions, and just hearing like how they got into it, why they got into it, what they're passionate about, what they think the future of L&D looks like. I think hearing those things from people and it not always being the same answer either was really insightful and made me realize actually the benefit of networking and keeping in touch with people and putting yourself out there a bit more brings a lot of value. And I think I understood the importance of networking before, but I don't think I really did it. And I think this event kind of forced me to, and I make the most of the 2 days, and I got a lot from it and people that I would still like talk to and connect with today. But lastly, I think it forces you to believe in yourself, because I think I definitely went there quite nervous, maybe having an element of imposter syndrome, thinking, okay, I was really excited to be part of the cohort, but now I'm actually here. I'm like, oh, do I deserve to be here? Like all these amazing people have done these incredible things. Is what I've done enough? And I think you definitely have an element of that. And I think that's quite rational to go through this sort of way of thinking. But I think it's also important to remember, especially in L&D, I guess, where it is so broad, people have achieved so many different things and they're still achieving different things. And I think I went there maybe with that imposter syndrome, but then I left realizing that there's so much out there that can still be done and everyone's achieved different things and it's all amazing. So yeah, I think I came away with believing in myself and wanting others to feel the same way about themselves.
I think that's a really important point, because L&D is one of those industries that has so much to it. And once you put different contexts, different types of organisations, industries, even cultures, and you've seen that in your career as well, that it's such a broad discipline that you can learn from lots of different people, and we should be trying to understand and see what are those transferable lessons, what are those tips and techniques, what are those different ways of looking at things that someone else looks at in a different sphere. And as much as trying to share knowledge, speak to new people, I think that is absolutely critical. So really glad to hear you talking about that. And given your background and you've moved around quite a bit, you've had lots of different roles, and I've heard through our conversation how important your own development is to you as well. What's next for you?
That's a really interesting question. I think for me, it's about making sure people are still engaging with learning, even though it's a really strange time and learning isn't necessarily face-to-face or as social as it previously could have been with conferences and meetups, etc. I think something I'm really trying to do within my own organisation is create more of a blended learning experience and make sure that our remote sessions are really engaging and insightful and useful, but also trying to create learning experiences in new ways and create more communities and interactive ways of learning during COVID times. But I also would like to branch more into learning about very real issues. So I'm also really passionate about well-being and making sure people are engaged at work and they feel included and safe. And I think learning can tie really nicely into those topics, because I think making sure you're speaking about them and people understand what they are and how they can ensure it for themselves, but also for those around them, I think that's really important. And I think as a learning professional, we can have a massive part to play in that experience and that journey. And I think if we've learned nothing else about COVID, it's about reflection and being kind to people and understanding. And work isn't everything. It's a huge part of our lives and it's an important part, but equally making sure we make time for other things and we're looking after people is just as important, if not more. And I think for me, I want to combine learning and almost, I suppose it comes back to my sociology sort of roots. I want to combine the learning and the society side of things, combining those to make sure that we're thinking about how to improve ourselves as a society and make sure people are feeling happy, included, looked after, engaged. And I think that's really important in personal life, but also in work life. So I'd like to have a part to play in that sort of journey.
I think that's a really nice place to sort of end, because what I take away from talking to you is that you're almost role modeling that, because I think storytelling and being open and natural with challenges you faced, and the fact that learning doesn't operate in isolation, work doesn't operate in isolation, our home lives and personal lives don't operate in isolation, they're all joined. So I think being able to be open and talk very authentically about your own experiences and to think more broadly than just the discipline you're working in, that's a great benchmark and way of operating for others as well. I think it's just a good way of setting that expectation, and being able to talk about yourself, being able to share for others should make it more natural for people to be able to do that for themselves as well. And I know that's not the only answer, but I think having that as part of how you approach things is a great start. Kerrie, thank you very much for joining us today. I think it's been a fascinating insight, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with you next on your journey.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure and it's been really fun. I'm looking forward to listening to the future ones too.
If people do want to follow you or get to know a bit more about your story or connect with you, how should they do that?
Yeah, I'd love that. Probably the easiest way is just to connect with me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn name is literally Kerrie Chatfield. Other than LinkedIn, I'm happy for James to connect the two of us and put me in touch with anyone who would like to have a further discussion.
If anyone does want to know any more about Kerrie or connect with her, we'll make sure that we put all of her details in the show notes below.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Learning Reinvented podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. You can register to join the Learning Effect community. The link to do so is in the show notes below. If you've not already done so, please follow our podcast. And if the Learning Effect can help you and your organisation, please do get in touch. You can find both James and Katie on LinkedIn, and our contact details are in the show notes below.